What's up, YouTube? Ryan Paney here. Hope you guys are doing reasonably well. Time for us to tackle another discography here. Haven't done one of these in a while. This is a relatively lean one about which I have extraordinarily unpopular opinions, so it should be a lot of fun. Armenian alt-metal juggernauts System of a Down. Just that once-in-a-lifetime band that is genuinely pretty weird and eccentric and often abrasive sonically. Not to mention politically high octane and tackled a lot of dark subjects over the years. Yet, for some reason, they are also like the quintessential picture of what mainstream success looks like in rock music, forget metal music. It's extremely difficult to think of another band in the broader heavy music space with that weird combination of traits that I just outlined. Here's the thing, I don't think people really realize by the numbers just how successful System of a Down are. 40 million records sold. 40 million. To put that in perspective, that's more than double Disturbed. That's way more than a band like Slayer, even though when you think metal, you think Slayer instantly. 33% more than Slipknot. And all the while, the two biggest System of a Down singles are about suicide and about the Iraq War. Frankly, I'm not sure that we're ever gonna see another band get that big worldwide playing that kind of music. It's mind-blowing. And it explains why, to this day, if System of a Down decided to put out a full-length studio album, I mean, they just dropped 2 tracks this past week, actually, but if they decided to put out a new studio album, it would be arguably a bigger deal than the record that Tool put out last year. So you take all that interesting shit, and then you throw into the mix the fact that my personal picks, I'm pretty sure every single spot on this list is going to upset a typical System of a Down fan, which makes me really happy. So you put all that together and you realize this is the perfect band for me to cover. So the System catalog is 5 records, released over just a 7-year time span, and they're all pretty different from each other, so it'll be fairly easy to draw some strong lines in the sand here. So let's get going. Okay, last place here at number 5. Despite how divisive the rest of my picks are gonna be, I'm pretty sure I'll get some backers on this one. Steal This Album. We look back at the internet panic of the early 2000s, and regardless of where you stand on it now with net neutrality and a bunch of other controversial topics, I think we can all say as music fans unequivocally that Lars was right. Lars was right. The internet has been a wonderful democratizing force in the world, but in terms of the sale and distribution of music as a commodity, not so much. And Metallica's decision to sue Napster back in the day, unlike a lot of their other creative decisions of that time period, has aged well. And System of a Down's third record, which followed the monstrous success of their first two, was one of those really unfortunate victims of those lawless early stages of internet music consumption in the early 2000s before we kind of figured it out, at least as much as you can figure it out. The title Steal This Album is a not so subtle reference to the fact that earlier that year, this album was leaked on the internet. And the thing is, the fact that it was leaked just months after Toxicity's release, it leaves you to wonder the whole time you're listening to it, are these B-sides? The guitar tone is pretty similar to Toxicity, and songs like Fuck the System and Theta Waves, I mean, they sound like they belong on Toxicity. And then other moments on the album, you have like one of my favorite tracks, the Sepultura biting Inner Vision or ADD. Those sound like they belong on the self-titled record. The band seemingly have neither confirmed nor denied this, but whatever the case may be, what we're left with here is an album that's pretty enjoyable, but lacks an independent musical identity. Like, there's no part of me that ever sits there and thinks about the Steal This Album era of System of a Down. The band, to me, have 3 distinct eras. They have self-titled, they have Toxicity, and they have the final dual albums. But Steal This Album just sounds like kind of a less refined mishmash of the first 2 records, which again is pretty enjoyable, but because of that, it ends up being the most uneventful release in their catalog. Frankly, it's most remembered for the context surrounding it, which was very unfortunate. Personally, I like it a lot. There's no System of a Down album that I don't like, and I return to this one the least, but I think a song like Chicken Stew is a really clever critique of consumerism. The song Boom is another one I gotta shout out because it's just a classic, very inconspicuous System of a Down anti-war song, and there's a lot of other highlights on here, but it's the album that I return to least, and I don't really view it as an independent chapter in the band's history. Number 4 is Mesmerized, the first installment of the band's final dual albums, Mesmerized and Hypnotized. These records were recorded at the same time, but I don't care what anyone tells you, they are not a double album. To me, they are very, very distinct from one another. even though they do begin and end with the same musical idea, which is Soldier Side. To the old school System fans, unfortunately, what these two records represent is a watering down of the band's sound. You have a significant influx of hard rock on a bunch of the tracks in these two records. You have a shit ton more melody just across the board, which is particularly due to guitarist Darren Malakian splitting the vocal duties with frontman Serj Tankian. Darren's voice is just a lot cleaner and more refined than Serj, which of course with Darren's band Scars on Broadway, we would go on to see just how high his hard rock billboard aspirations were with the songs he was writing in that band. But I reject that premise completely. That is totally wrong. These albums were not a watering down of the band's sound. What they actually were an expansion of the band's sound. If you want to just listen to nu metal over and over again, Korn's got a big catalog, guys. On Mesmerized and Hypnotized, the complexity of the songs, the overall musical skill delivered by all the band members, the increasing breadth of influences being used. There's just a massive creative growth from Toxicity, Steal This Album to these albums. I mean, you can't deny it. So with that out of the way, when we look at Mesmerized and Hypnotized, the vast majority of fans prefer Mesmerized. And they could not be more wrong. And here's why. The dirty little secret about Mesmerized is when you dig just a little bit below the surface, you actually have all of the band's most bland and run-of-the-mill songwriting ideas. System are beloved for their eccentricity and their otherworldly weirdness and out-of-the-box creativity and their jarring challenges to the typical hyper-masculine metal form, and that's all kind of what makes them appealing to a lot of people. But on Mesmerized, beneath the weird lyrics about dicks and porn and cocaine and Tony Danza, the actual musical ideas and riffs that are driving these songs, when you examine them closely, they're super plain and pedestrian. I mean, seriously, you remember a song like Violent Pornography for its weird-ass lyrics, but when you listen to the riffs driving the song, that mid-tempo chugging that's just in every single metal song ever. Or Cocaine, that's another good example, just the chord progression that drives the song. How many times have you heard that? Or just the entire song Revenja. Sad Statue is another glaring example of pretty, I mean, it's a great song, but pretty straightforward riffs and melodies. Again, you get the sense that as quirky and offbeat as the lyrics and even the vocal inflections are, the actual musical underpinning is the most standard stuff that System ever wrote. And not that there's anything terribly wrong with that. I mean, as a band, if your biggest, most grave sin is making some songs that kind of sound like songs that other people make, I mean, that's a mark of a special band. But we gotta hold them to their own standard, and for a band that's defined by their innovation and their just plain weirdness and out-of-the-box creativity, there are chunks of this album that, again, feel very pedestrian. Of course, several shining moments make this overall a good album. Don't get me wrong. I mean, BYOB alone is one of the most transcendent singles in metal history. The way it just knocks you off your feet with that startling stop-start aggression, but then also has this weirdly successful party song vibe to it, and on top of that has some of the most biting and iconic anti-war lyrics of the Iraq era. That song just blows me away to this day. I first heard it when I was like 10 or 11 years old, and to this day I'm still just, pun intended, mesmerized by it. And Radio Video is a favorite of mine with that bouncy syncopated bridge, which totally defies everything I said about the chunks of this album that are less innovative. And then Old School Hollywood is a song that just fucking slams. I don't care if it sounds like everybody else. And again, Sad Statue and Lost in Hollywood, the closer, are also songs that I enjoy the straightforward nature of. Don't get me wrong. It's just that when I listen to Mesmerized as a whole, it's clear to me that I'm listening to the most safely written System of a Down record. Now, number 3 is where I lose everybody. So, see ya. Toxicity. Toxicity is one of the most widely celebrated, critically acclaimed, and commercially successful metal releases of all time. I mean, I was gonna say 21st century, but of all time works too. You get the point. And I know saying this makes me the bad guy, but a big chunk of this album's critical stature is purely attributable to context. Context matters. Because let's face it, the rest of metal music in 2001 was... And even now, a big chunk of the appeal of this album is listening to it and just going, wow, System of a Down were so unique and so different from the rest of metal music at that time in 2001. And that's true. This is a difficult album to categorize. It's way too nuanced to be a nu metal record. I know Scott Ian from Anthrax has said it's a thrash metal record. I totally disagree with that. But that fusion of nu metal and thrash metal and alt metal and a little bit of hard rock is what made this album so special to so many people. But frankly, when you really dig into the meat of the track list here, some of System of a Down's most relentlessly repetitive material is on this record. If I'm gonna get a headache from a System of a Down record, it's gonna be this one. Again, listened in full, because if one of my favorite songs from this record comes on, I'm fucking psyched as anybody. But material on here like Bounce, which is, by the way, is the perfect example of the kind of song you should never play for a non-metal fan trying to get into the genre. Jet Pilot, same issue there. And this is not even to touch on some of the melodic attempts that fall flat, like the song Forest. And that's why when I say there was a creative and musical growth from Toxicity / Steal This Album to the Mesmerized, Hypnotized albums, the reason I say that is because songs like Forest would have worked in that era of the band because they refined that and just brightened their melodic sensibilities. People tend to conflate a few brilliant songs with a brilliant all-around album. It's a common mistake, and in this case especially, I mean, how could you blame them? The opening 1-2 punch alone of Prison Song and Needles is just fucking crushing, especially Prison Song, which has such a rousing political statement attached to it that's just as relevant now in 2020 as it was almost 20 years ago. And then Deer Dance keeps that energy up. Obviously, Chop Suey is one of the first metal songs that most people hear when getting into the genre. Aerials is completely one of a kind. There's a ton to like here, and I totally get the glow that those few tracks create around the album, but we gotta evaluate albums as a whole. And I'm sorry, Toxicity is not System's best, despite what people tell you. An album I like better, for example, is the self-titled debut. This is where System of a Down actually have a direct parallel with their peer Slipknot, in that their self-titled debut is actually the only classifiably nu metal release by them, despite that label continually being slapped on them over time. This is a nu metal album, and a glorious one at that. I mean, just listen to the way those openly strummed drop tune guitars rattle around in the mix. They sound like they're supposed to be blasted out of a Walkman or at a skate park. Soil and D-Devil, and of course No, one of my favorite tracks with those staccato vocals and guitars. I mean, these are just pure bare-knuckle nu metal assaults. Also, Suggestions and War are another two of my favorites, with the way they just wholeheartedly embrace dissonance. And the quirky but explosive single on here, Sugar, I'd argue is a top 5 nu metal song, period. So to me, the self-titled is a quintessential nu metal record, but at the same time, it expands so broadly on that movement's limited parameters. Just the song Peephole alone would be enough to make my case, with all that eccentric polka stuff being thrown into the recipe. Another favorite track on here that I'm sure I share with a lot of you guys is Pluck, the politically oriented closer, which definitely hints at some of the band's future speed metal tendencies, which we'll get to that in a second. Also, the dynamic 6-minute cut Mine is another outlier here. So System were already looking to the horizon creatively here. But at the same time, this record is just a wonderful time capsule and a high point for what mainstream metal music sounded like in the mid to late 90s. And through your impressive powers of deduction, you have likely surmised, is that the word, surmised, that my highly unpopular pick for the best System of a Down album is Hypnotized. Ah, fuck it, I already lost a lot of you guys at number 3. This album it isn't universally disliked by the System of a Down fan base, but it definitely has the least enthusiasm in the aggregate from fans. So let me explain why I disagree with everybody. First and foremost, and this might reveal some of my biases, but this is the album where System of a Down spend a substantial chunk of time exploring the worlds of speed metal and thrash metal, and it does fucking wonders for their sound. Toxicity has those influences too, like we talked about, especially on a song like Jet Pilot or on Deer Dance, but Hypnotized really fucking goes for it. You have the opening thrasher Attack, which is just one of the best fucking songs this band ever wrote. Furious speed picking and blast beats and a crushing halftime groove in that final chorus. Just an explosive song. Also the following track, Dreaming, which is a song that turns the gas pedal on and off, but during the aggressive portions, it's just as overwhelming as Attack is. Then Tentative, maybe my favorite song in here, just beautiful, screeching, dissonant speed metal perfection. Also, Stealing Society is definitely worth mentioning in this conversation. These influences don't overtake or overwhelm the System of a Down sound, but they inject so much fucking life into it, even when it's in smaller doses, like on Dreaming, which I mentioned. And going off of those points about the band wading into speed metal territory a little bit, we also have, by far, the most musically skilled System of a Down album from everybody, whether it's drummer John Dolmayan and those furious blast beats that we just talked about in the aforementioned tracks, or it's a couple of shreddy guitar solos showing up here and there, like on the song Lonely Day, which is a song that should not work. The riffs on this album are increasingly complex, The arrangements have a lot more peaks and valleys and are a lot less repetitive than any System of a Down album before this. There's just a heightened level of musicianship across the board on Hypnotized that is undeniable. But what is so cool about Hypnotized, and frankly why it's number one, is that even though the band's playing and songwriting is at its most intricate, and some of their most vicious songs are on here, like we've already discussed, this album also manages to be their most melodic release by an even wider margin. Darren and Serge's vocal trading here is such a healthy mix. A song like Attack, actually, is a great example of how well they complement each other. Or She's Like Heroin, the way they harmonize on there. Or Soldier's Side, the epic closer here. This extra dose of melodicism in the System of a Down sound, it just approaches the edge of campy, but it blows the doors wide open for the band creatively and makes their music that much more dynamic and that much more powerful. I mean, you see this play out all over the record in like the bridge to Tentative, which is just, I want to say it was mesmerizing, but I definitely made that joke already. So we'll say it leaves you transfixed. The bridge to Tentative does. Coming up with the fucking adjectives here sometimes is a pain in the ass. The haunting closer, Soldier Side, with that climactic layered guitar solo is just unbelievable. The title track, again, Lonely Day, which should not have worked, but works as a hard rock radio song and also has a very cool solo in it, which is frankly what maybe saves it. I realize to a lot of people this stuff kind of diluted the band's sound, but to me, it did the opposite. I cannot imagine the System of a Down catalog if we had never seen this full scope of what they are capable of musically. That is a depressing thought. And Toxicity, I'm sorry, it's a great record, but chunks of it feel pretty monochromatic when put up against the broad musical spectrum of Hypnotized. And I will defend that to my fucking grave. This record is unbelievable. But hey, either way, wherever you fall on the System of a Down catalog, what we can agree on is the band's ability to cross over commercially like they did in such a big way, and retain their uncompromising political messaging, retain their just head-turning weirdness, retain their metallic edge, all of that. This is a once-in-a-lifetime band. And if they never put out another note of music, these 5 records will sustain me until I die. So of course, be sure to leave in the comments your version of the top 5 System of a Down records. There's only 5 records, but I feel like there's probably a lot of combinations, and none of them were mine. So, as always, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video and are not yet subscribed to my channel, please consider doing so by clicking right over here, as well as checking out any of the other rock or metal-related content that I publish here on a weekly basis. I really appreciate you guys watching, liking, disliking, just engaging in any fashion. Twitter, Instagram handle @RyanPannyMusic. Again, thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you soon.